In the beginning, I was a disciple of culture, family, parents, and the world.
The sense of homesickness, the sense of never quite being where I was meant to be, that only intensified because I realized that there was no single place out there that I could call home.
Then I became a disciple of light.
I left and I found that my sense of homesickness intensified all the more because this wasn't home either. It was a laboratory where I was confronted by the self.
Light pointed me toward becoming a disciple of the darkness.
I learned to inhabit other places, but also learned to inhabit myself with a greater sense that it was possible to live with a spirit of discovery rather than ownership.
Darkness held me until I reached the ultimate state of being a disciple of the divine within myself and all those that I meet.
Welcome. You have entered the realm of 1111 Talk Radio. Your host is Simran. It's time to discover your own language with the universe. Empower yourself, broaden your mind, open your heart, and discover who you are. Now, here's your host, Simran.
Give me a home that isn't mine, where I can slip in and out of rooms without a trace, never worrying about the plumbing, the color of the curtains, the cacophony of books by the bedside. A home that I can wear lightly, where the rooms aren't clogged with yesterday's conversations, where the self doesn't bloat to fill in the crevices. A home like this body, so alien when I try to belong, so hospitable when I decide I'm just visiting. These beautiful words are from Arundhathi Subramaniam. I have to say, this book deeply touched me, and I want everyone to run out and get it. If you are a seeker, if you want to dive into the mystery, if you want to be left in your own silence and awe, and if you want to embrace the ordinary within the extraordinary, this is definitely a book you want to pick up. Women Who Wear Only Themselves is lyrical and wise, poetic and revolutionary, and you really do feel the soul of Arundhathi as she also guides us with her wisdom and the beauty of her language. Words and language inspire me, and she truly is a poet, a lyricist, a mystic in her own right, bringing together the voices of four women mystics walking very different spiritual paths. Poet and seeker Arundhathi Subramaniam reveals the expansive potential of forging an intimate personal connection with the divine. Described as one of the finest poets writing in India today and a unique poet of our times in a league all by herself, Arundhathi is a leading Indian poet and author of 15 books of poetry and prose. Her most recent work includes the landmark Penguin Anthology of Indian Female Mystic Poetry, Wild Women, the Book of Poems, the Gallery of Upside Down Women, and a prose work on 4 contemporary women on spiritual journeys, Women Who Wear Only Themselves. Welcome, Arundhathi, to 1111 Talk Radio. I am so delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much, Simran. That was a beautiful introduction, a very thoughtful introduction. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I love the framing of this book right from the beginning. And to open with that poem around home, I think every human being is longing to come home. And we often have many times that we feel lost. And we grasp for that place of home that sometimes is just a finger grasp away, and it can disappear. And at other times we find ourselves fully immersed in it. You shared about having a niggling sense of being an imposter in the body. So often I have found myself there. So that's where I'd like to start. That feeling of imposterism, that search to belong.
I'm so glad you started with the poem and you read it as well as you did. It's a poem that matters a great deal to me, and it was written, I think, in 2003. And in so many ways, it seems to anticipate the directions that my life has since taken. I believe the sense of being an imposter, which is the line you picked up on and which is astute, really, I think that sense of being an imposter has been around for as long as I can remember. And when I look back on my life in Bombay, and I look back on some of my early writing as a 9 and 10-year-old, I realized that my writing, even then, in its own blundering, unconscious way, was circling these themes of belonging. Where did I really belong? And many years later, when I became a poet or a practitioner of poetry, and I had a book out, my second book was called Where I Live, I realized I needed to call it that because I didn't know where I belonged, but I did know where I lived. And I was constantly trying to circle this idea of where I belonged, but I was never quite sure. And so the poems try to measure the gap between where I live and where I belong. I think the journey started a long time ago in an unconscious way, but it grew more conscious in the 90s. When I was a young person, maybe around my teens and 20s, it intensified around 97 when I had an experience of silence. And it was an experience that changed something fundamentally for me when I started emerging from it a week after it. What changed was I was no longer just a poet or just a journalist or just a cultural commentator or whatever, all the epithets that we acquire along the way to make ourselves feel consequential. I realized that I was fundamentally a seeker and I desperately needed guidance. So around 97, I'd say, was the first turning point. 2004 was another, when I met someone whom I consider to be my spiritual guide. And so the journey took on a certain shift at that time because I finally found a practice that I could call my own, a path that I could call my own. And yet, Simran, what happened at that time was the sense of homesickness, the sense of never quite being where I was meant to be, that only intensified because I realized that there was no single place out there that I could call home. And if Mumbai or Bombay, which is a city of many names and faces, if that had kept me going all these years of my life, suddenly it no longer could. And so, as I say in the introduction to this book, I left. And I went off to an ashram, a yoga center in southern India. And I found that my sense of homesickness intensified all the more because this wasn't home either. It was a laboratory where I was confronted by the self. And so I began to realize, Simran, that I was essentially a vagabond and I was hurtling from an ashram in South India to literary conferences, to my parents' home, to the homes of friends and colleagues, but I really wasn't in a place that I could call my home. And it is through this process of being a nomad, of really finding that there was no context that I could call my own, that I began to realize there's only one place, of course, that was always meant to be home, that and nowhere else, and that is the self. It is the stuff of cliche, and I should have known this a long time ago, but I didn't. I realized I needed to make the journey. I needed to be that vagabond in order to discover this very fundamental truth for myself. And so looking back on my life today, when I'm now between multiple homes, I realize that I've moved from being a vagabond to a person with a sense of multiple citizenship, where I have many places in the world that I can call my home. But most importantly, I've discovered the importance of seeking it and finding it on occasion within. That for me has been the journey, and it's the journey that mirrors so many journeys before mine, so many that have been written about, so many that have been talked of. We all need to make that journey ourselves to reclaim these truths and rediscover that they're actually living reality.
I love that. I think that that's why I resonate so deeply, not only with your book, but your manner of writing. You have so much richness to share in your experience, but also in your languaging of everything. In my latest trilogy, which is about the multidimensional experience of being human, the first book is actually called Living, the 7 Blessings of Human Experience. And the first blessing is the blessing of seeking. It is this gift to be seeking. I have several different paths, but I don't have the path of the vagabond. You said you were learning to live as a guest. If we took life to be this exploration, or as you said, the laboratory where you're the scientist and the experiment, and lived as the guest, that profoundly shifts perspective. It profoundly shifts meaning and even purpose.
The poem ends with that line, a home like this body, so alien when I try to belong, so hospitable when I decide I'm just visiting. And I think I realized that by being a visitor, I learned to inhabit other places, but also learned to inhabit myself differently, not with a sense of entitlement, but with a greater sense of wonder and of gratitude, and a sense that it was possible to live with a spirit of discovery rather than ownership. That made a huge difference to the way in which I approached my life as well as my writing. And I hope that I try to retain some of that and work towards retaining that at least every day.
Well, what I did love about some ownership that you took, which is common to all of us, was the hunger. And you spoke to that nameless hunger or the thirst that existed within you. Some words, my home, my tribe, my garment, myself. And that is the spiritual journey where we start to discover ourselves beyond who we are. Even with the stories that you share of these four amazing individuals, it is this release, this renunciation that is part of the path continuously. Can you talk about any sort of release or changes that you had to make that maybe mirror some of the encounters that you had?
For me, it was about letting go of the labels, the hard-won labels in my life in Mumbai as a writer, as a journalist, as a curator, as a partner. I was also letting go of a marriage when I left Mumbai and moved to the ashram in 2010. It had been a gradual meltdown of labels, and there's really nothing like that meltdown to leave you feeling bewildered. So it was a state of great bewilderment. And yet, when I look back on a poem that I wrote around that time, I realized that there was also a sense of ecstasy, a sense of awe at what was unfolding, because I had a very strong sense of being guided as well. And this is what I believe the spiritual path gave me and a guru gave me, which is the sense of being more anchored in myself than ever before. And if that had not been the case, Simran, I don't think I'd have been able to take a step of this kind at all. And so, yes, I did go to the ashram and I spent time there. And as I said, I realized that wasn't home either. So I'd let go of many things, a home, a partner, relationships, animals that were dear to me, my cats, my professional life, many of the labels that I had associated with myself. And with that went the indignity, really, of an absence of identity, external identity. But when I look back now, I realize it was thanks to that period of seeming anchorlessness, when I was learning to be more and more moored in the self. It was thanks to that period that I began to write from a place much deeper in myself than I ever had before. And so my anthology of bhakti poetry, devotional poetry, which is called Eating God, emerged from that period. My book, When God is a Traveler, emerged from that period. And all the writing that I've done since, I think, has emerged from a deeper place within myself. The timbre of my voice changed as a poet as well. The quality of my poetry changed. A hoarseness perhaps entered the voice, a greater ability to trust silences. I think all that changed who I was, how I wrote, and how I breathed. All of that shift. So later, when I seemed to acquire some of these labels all over again, it was with a newfound sense of discovery and an ability to wear these definitions lightly. I don't take them very seriously at all. All the stuff about being the writer of 15 books and so on, that's important. It offers you a certain shortcut to know who I am or what I've done. But I think I wear those definitions more lightly than I ever did. I don't take it terribly seriously. I know how easily it is possible for one to lose one's way, how easy it is to lose one's voice, how easy it is to be confronted by the great silence from which these words that we are speaking right now, these very words emerge. I think it's with perhaps a greater humility that one approaches these labels now.
That is part of the reason why I called you mystic in the beginning, because what you're speaking of is that spiritual journey that if we grace it upon ourselves of the letting go, it does start to take us down that path. And it opens us to that greater spiritual maturity that does exist. And you wrote in your book that it was a journey from unbelonging to voluntary exile. And I think that that is something that we have to make that conscious choice with at a certain point. And that the silence was so profound. So I'd love to know, in regard to the silence, is that the place that you really found poetry to be the easiest way to share what was in feeling that sometimes is so hard to describe? And also you describe yourself as a listener. Is it through that doorway that you realized that it was in the listening that there was more power?
That's a wonderful question. And if I were to be honest, I'd say that I was drawn to poetry as a child. And I was drawn to it because it is rhythmic language, because it is sensuous language, because it's exuberant, buoyant language, all those reasons. But what I hadn't perhaps fully understood is that when you speak of rhythm, you're actually talking about a patterning of silence and sound. And you cannot have an endless onrush of sound without at some point making your peace with silence. When I look back on that experience that I mentioned of 97, when I was in a state of wordlessness in many ways, I was able to speak, but none of my words touched the place of silence that I inhabited at that time. When I speak of that experience, I speak of it as a remembrance. And I use that word consciously because that is what your name means, doesn't it, Simran?
Yes, it
Yeah?
does. Mm-hmm.
So it was for me a remembrance of where all sound emerges from. That is the silence. Without that silence, there would be none of this, none of the sensuousness and beauty of language that I so prized. Coming face to face with that silence was for me a reconfiguration of self. When poetry began to return after 97, I found that it began to return differently. It was more perforated with holes than ever before. There were more pauses, more gaps, and a greater ability to trust those gaps, because those gaps are full of life. Those gaps are the very source of language. So I think I was able to trust those gaps more than I ever had in the past, simply because I had fallen into one of those gaps myself and realized that without acknowledging them, there can be no poetry and there can be no life. So I started, I think, inviting them into my poems more consciously than ever before. The only people I could read at the time were the mystic poets, because their poems seemed to have this ability to speak of wonder and speak of bewilderment in a way that made sense to me. They still remain the poets who rescue me time and time again when I need it. But I also believe that I have a spiritual practice now that compels me to spend more conscious daily time with myself and with silence. And so that makes my approach to language somewhat different from the way it was. And I hope that it affects the way in which I live my life on a daily basis as well.
The Western world is so busy, so distracted, very noisy. That space between is often taken for granted. You also speak about being at a new kind of lost, where earlier the lost was of pain. Most people could probably understand that place of lost. But then you say, I was lost again, a darkly euphoric freefall, where you had authored the architecture of your own unmaking. Talk about the distinction between those two lost places.
The earlier homesickness was just looking for a destination that one could put down one's baggage in. It was a quest in the hope that one could put down one's baggage and still remain pretty much the same person. One was actually looking for a place. I think that's why, the very idea of home is often so differently understood. One was looking for a place that one could call one's own. Not geographical, but a place inside the self where you can feel, I'm still the same person, but I have come home. Some place that didn't feel so alien and so embattled. That was the first lost. But the second kind of lost that I mention in the book is the time when I realized that everything that I had considered to be myself, all the epithets that I'd mentioned earlier, the things that made me a seemingly productive member of the society I lived in, none of those labels applied anymore. So it was a new kind of lost. I was now alone and I was with myself. There was a strange sense of having authored my life script, even while everything was being dismantled.
The woman doesn't call herself a saint, just a lover of a saint who's been dead 300 years. She doesn't see people on weekdays, but her master tells her we're safe. So she calls us into where she sits, her body blazing in its nakedness, a crumpled afterthought. Its tummy fold and breast sag, and wild spiraling nipple reminding us that life is circles, crazy, looping, involuting, dazzling circles. She tells us the world calls her a whore. She told her master about it too, but he only said the rest of the world serves many masters. Family, money, lovers, bosses, fame, power, money, money in endless carousels. Samsara. But you, love, think only of me. Who's the whore here? My guest, Arundhathi Subramaniam, one of the finest poets writing in India today. And her book is Women Who Wear Only Themselves, 4 Sacred Travelers on the Journey. You can find out more at arundhatisubramaniam.com. That link is in the bio description, along with the link to get her book. We'll be right back after these messages. Join my Substack. My publication is Beyond the Illusion, and you can find it at iamsimran1111.substack.com. That link is in the bio description. You'll actually receive all of the 1111 magazine issues on audio as part of that, in addition to the weekly prompt, inquiry, contemplation, and meditation that I provide to all of the subscribers on the annual membership. That link is in the bio description.
You are listening to 1111 Talk Radio. Simran is an award-winning author, publisher of 1111 Magazine, powerful speaker of wisdom, and a life mentor. Find out more at iamsimran.com. Now, back to 1111 Talk Radio.
I really enjoy working individually with people. If you're looking for some additional support and guidance, and you really want to dive into the subtle, then there are quite a few options on my website at iamsimran.com that have to do with shadow work or manifestation if you want a more focused approach on a particular thing, as well as individual sessions around deciphering signs, symbols, and synchronicities, gaining a better understanding of how the universe is speaking to you, your particular dialect. That link is in the bio description. Could you imagine having conversations that unfold, ones that take your breath away, that have you look at life in a completely different manner, some that might be shocking, others that are awe-inspiring, and all of which leave you gasping for that ecstatic place that they have reached, and yet the fear grips you. Can I do that? Do I dare have the courage? Could I possibly renunciate all that they have? It's an interesting thing to ponder. And Arundhathi Subramaniam writes in her book, Women Who Wear Only Themselves, 4 Sacred Travelers on the Journey. As each conversation unfolded, I found it was often quite enough to listen, to pause, to suspend conclusion, to marvel at the variety of fingers, the diverse darting tongues of fire. Rather than paraphrase or decode them, it is enough, I believe, to look to where they point. And if one is lucky, drink silver.
I was with myself. And I realized that in this new kind of lost, completely without reference points, there was a strange sense of having authored my life script, even while everything was being dismantled. It was that sense of being ambushed by a spiritual journey, of having been found deeply, and yet there was no single place that I could anchor myself in. If anything, I'd given up all the addresses that I could have called home. And yet there was a sense that I was the architect, finally, of my life script.
So many places in your book are rich with your own insight on top of who you're sharing. The book opens up very boldly to share with us the lover, one who willingly gave up everything, one who had to give up everything, one who ecstatically loved. Before we get into that first story, what had you go on this mission to share these voices? What was the thirst you were feeling?
First was really the fact that while I had been deeply nourished by the voices of male mystics, all those whom I'd read about, all the poets whom I prized down the ages, those that I met and even wrote about, like Satguru, for instance, who's been my guide, and I wrote his biography, and I feel very deeply grateful for all of that. And all the mystic poets I've read and archived and documented and anthologized, I'm grateful to all of them because they've offered me sanctuary in their own ways. But a question that returned for me constantly, Simran, is where are the women? And I found that even the mystic women poets have been turned into decorative calendar art. We no longer smell the power or the danger or the sensuality in their poems. That's one part of it, which gave rise to an entire anthology of Indian mystics and their poetry, which I did, called Wild Women. But a question that remained then was, where are the women of our times? Do they even exist? And I realized in the great quiet of the pandemic that I was actually sitting on interviews that I had done with two extraordinary women. And I asked myself then, why is it that I only think of these women as interesting interviews that I may write up for an article? Why do I never see them and acknowledge them as vital presences on the spiritual landscape? Is it just because they don't have marketing managers to amplify their voices and to make them spiritual celebrities? Is it just because their ashrams don't feature in Lonely Planet guides? Is it for that reason? And if so, then I needed to look at myself and why I was making those assumptions. And so I sat down and I started writing up these interviews. And that's how this particular book emerged. I had happened to have met this exceptional woman whom you speak of in your introduction to this segment. Her name is Annapurni Amma, and I happened to have met her a couple of years before I started writing this essay on her. It was a chance encounter. I was wandering through southern India, visiting various temples with a sannyasi friend of mine, entirely by accident, just maybe a whisper of design because someone mentioned her. We happened to land up at her ashram and we never thought we'd be allowed in because it seemed to be closed. But then this young sannyasi, this renunciate, appeared and said, okay, come on in, she'll see you. And I walked into her room and I saw this woman resplendent in her own nakedness, sitting there with such a sense of poise and majesty that she took my breath away. And she wore her body the way in which I never imagined anyone could wear it. And then I realized, Simran, that these are living spiritual traditions in the subcontinent. I thought back on the 12th century mystic poet Akka Mahadevi, who walked the world naked. I thought of the 14th century Kashmiri woman poet Lal Ded, who walked the world naked. I mean, these are extraordinary figures, but we believe they've happened somewhere in the distant past. And here is this woman sitting amid the din and the cacophony of the modern world, sitting in quite the same way, empowered by her guru, who also walked the world naked, except he happened to have lived 3 centuries ago. But for Annapurni Amma, this is no dead guru. This is a living presence. He is more alive to her than even I am, or I was when I was sitting in front of her that day. And so talking to this woman who had given up all manner of cultural and social restraint, including her clothes, including her family, and who had taken to this life of mendicancy, and who later became a spiritual guide in her own right to her disciples, just listening to her that day was for me a reminder of the extraordinary courage that a decision like this takes. It was also a reminder for me that we live in a subcontinent, certainly in a country, even today in India, which is where I come from, where these spiritual traditions are not dead and gone. They are living traditions. These wisdom traditions, whether ecstatic or contemplative, are alive. That is the capaciousness of the spiritual culture. And to me, it would be a tragedy if we standardized that in any way, or if we simply dismissed that. I do believe that there is a need to acknowledge this living hospitality of wisdom traditions. These are alive and kicking even as we speak. And to me, Annapurni Amma, in all her nakedness, in all her fierce, passionate devotion to her guru, exemplified that.
It is fierce. It brought me to a great pause to even know of her because I was not familiar, to consider all that she gave up and yet the ecstasy of her love for her guru and how alive he is for her. I have been thinking over the past few weeks not to discount the value of the celebrity guru or the celebrity personal growth master or any of these spiritual leaders that are out there that do have all the marketing and the pomp and circumstance in front of them. There are many, probably far more than we realize, that are living their dharma, their purpose, providing the energy on this planet in very quiet ways, foundational to our existence, that do ripple out in some sort of way. This felt very much like that. It felt like something ancient still present.
That's beautifully put. That's exactly what it felt like. Ancient and deeply contemporary all at once.
That's the paradox that lay within your book and also within her life story in particular, because to read about her agony and her tears about her children and the things that she went to, and then to completely flip to the ecstasy of the love, and of course I would do that. She really embraced the full gamut of being both human and divine.
Absolutely. And her vulnerability, Simran, for me, that was her strength. That's what I realized as I sat with her. Her ability to laugh one moment, and at the same time, when she spoke of her sons, her ability to cry, and at the same time to speak ecstatically of her guru, all of it felt real, felt authentic. I felt I was in the presence of a human being of great integrity.
The courage you speak of is vast that takes place, and the other thread that I saw weaving through all four of the stories was the spiritual quality of dispassion, a high spiritual quality that must be attained to be able to walk such a path.
You're absolutely right.
How did you experience that dispassion? Because people hearing that word, many may think, oh, that's apathy, that's disconnection, but it's actually very much the opposite. How did you experience it in the presence of each of them?
Each of them embodies it differently. There's Annapurni Amma who actually chooses to give up her family. She gives up her clothing, she gives up her home, she gives up really everything. This is a woman who wears herself very literally as well. Nothing but herself. That's one kind of renunciation. But there's also the last portrait in the book, which is the portrait of a monk. And I wanted that there because for many of us, the monastic life seems like a medieval life choice. And Ma Karpuri is a reminder that it is not. She is a reminder that you can be deeply human, that you can have a wonderful sense of humor, a contagious love of life, and still be a monk. And every time I'm in her presence, she is a reminder for me that monkhood is not a state of cheerless self-denial. She's capable of exclaiming in great delight when she sees something she loves, when she sees a sari that she admires. But there's not a trace of wistfulness personally. There's no sense of wanting it for herself. And that's when I realized that it is possible to see monkhood as a state of abundance in itself. It's not about denying the self. It's about allowing your heart to grow expansive enough to accommodate everything. And when you do, you don't have to own, you don't have to grasp at any one thing, because you are, in fact, an owner of it all, just like every other individual is. But we need to open our hearts for that. And that kind of amplitude of the heart is what, to me, Ma Karpuri represents. Then there is someone like Balarishi, who is the woman who's on the path of the yoga of sound, Nada yoga. And Bala Rishi is a wonderful anomaly because she starts out as a guru. She's propelled into the role of a guru because she has all these paranormal capabilities. But she realizes somewhere along the way that while she has this ability to divine what is going on in people's lives, she has a path of her own, a path of self-discovery through sound, which leads her to profound places of silence. I call her, as you see, the reluctant guru, the person who realizes she has a vocation, but wants to do it on her terms this time. She will not be propelled by social compulsion as she was before to play that role. So this is an interesting woman, a woman on the cusp of becoming a spiritual teacher. And she fascinated me, and she also wears herself in her own way. She no longer wears the white robe of renunciation that she was in some way coerced into earlier when she felt she had to play the role of the teacher. She now chooses on occasion to wear blue jeans. Here's yet another woman choosing to wear herself on her own terms.
It's so easy for the mind, for the ego to cast stereotypes or judgments upon these, such as we could think of monks as being submissive, but
Yes.
she very much was in her power. She very much was the devotee to what she desired. And in the same way, Balarishi allowed herself to be herself. This is also breaking apart some of our false beliefs of not only how we see spiritual leaders or those that are serving in a different way, but how we as women can show up and the power of that.
I agree completely. And I think far too often, Simran, we tend to approach the various choices that are sometimes before us when we embark on a spiritual journey. We tend to approach them judgmentally. And every time something doesn't seem to fit, a practice doesn't seem to fit, or a particular path doesn't seem to work, we end up deriding the practice or the guru. To me, what was important was to present these women not as victims, because they are not. They're not victims of their lives. They are people who choose to carve their lives on their terms. They're women of agency. They're women of autonomy. And it was very important for me to present them in all their plurality, the many different choices they've made. It was important for me to present that because at the end of the day, I'm not saying that this book is in any way advocating a particular teacher or spiritual path. It is in fact saying that there's a host of ways in which we can walk the spiritual journey, and we don't have to keep judging as we walk. We don't have to judge the other. We walk our journey. We walk it with pride, and we take ownership of that journey. That's what each of these women has done.
In that ownership of the journey, it was really clear that these women had a choice, but yet they had no choice because they were compelled. There was something so much bigger that was playing out that was almost magnetizing for them to follow this path.
That's true too. That is the magic of the journey. That is the inevitability of the journey. And in many ways, that's really what life is about, isn't it? The sense of surprise and inevitability all at once. You know, it's in many ways, I think of the art of poetry in a similar way. You're always trying to write the line that startles, but which also feels deeply true and deeply familiar all at once. To me, that's what these women represent. Yes, there is a calling, and there is the courage to follow that calling. In doing so, there is a certain amount of stumbling. There is a certain amount of blundering. But there is also the joy with which they walk their journey that makes it uniquely theirs.
None of these women take anything personally. It's like they're neutral in regard to the things that happen. They feel everything. They rise above everything, but it's not personal.
I think you've really zeroed in on a very important aspect of the journey. The fact that it is possible to be deeply involved with life and yet not encumbered by it. These are people who are deeply present, and when they're present, they're taking in everything that goes on around them. They're with you when they're with you. They're not embroiled in what I call that crazy autopilot of samsara. So each one of them has chosen to drop certain sticky, gluey attachments. And of course, they've dropped it with the grace of their spiritual guides, with, whatever you might call that grace. And each one of them would probably credit their gurus or the goddess with that. But it is true that they have dropped them. And that's the reason they're able to walk tall and to inhabit themselves with the fearlessness that they do. They're freedom seekers above all. I think, one doesn't have to be someone who defines the spiritual journey in any narrow sense to read about these women. If you're a lover of freedom, you will recognize something fundamental about each of their journey.
There's a lot of conversation about the divine feminine. Even the Dalai Lama has said it is women who will end up taking the world to the place that it needs to go. And yet, just the use of the word can have such a range, what people project onto divine feminine, what that means, what that does in the world, how that's supposed to act. And it really is beyond feminism. When you look at these four individuals, after having spent time with them and talking with them, how do you define divine feminine?
On Lata Mani, I just say that what is so amazing about her journey is that she actually discovers the goddess as her guide by inhabiting her body deeply. This is a cerebral woman who is compelled to drop into the body, which becomes a place of great agony because she's had a brain injury, as you know, in the case of that, in that portrait. She drops into her body and discovers through the pain, through the body, she discovers the goddess. And with that, I'd like to return to what I see as the divine feminine, because it connects with that very deeply. In 2010, when I entered a goddess temple that had just been consecrated by Sadhguru in Coimbatore, I entered it believing that the idea of the goddess in some way resonated with my feminist understanding of, how the divine could be presented. I wasn't naive enough to believe that there was a woman in the sky. That wasn't it, obviously. It was about saying, okay, it appeals in some way to the idea of encoding the sacred as feminine. I entered that shrine and I sat there. And as I heard the 33 names of the goddess being uttered, I realized that I had always known what the divine feminine was about. I was not being introduced to the goddess. I had always known her. And I don't want to sound in any way like I'm mystifying this. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is a part of the self that we all recognize when, in fact, we have, as I did that day, some external validation of it. But this is a part of the self that we often relegate to the shadows. And to me, Devi is a living presence. The goddess is a living presence because I encountered her outside of me and she pointed me back to myself. And she is for me primarily this, a reminder that the creator does not stand apart from her creation. The goddess is that energy that is deeply, passionately involved with the minutiae of creation. She doesn't stand aloof. She doesn't stand disengaged, but she is that deep and utter inclusion. As I say, you reach her through her. That to me is the divine feminine.
Lata Mani's story, there's much about Tantra. That is that entry point into the body. That is that expression of allowing our full sensuality, our full sexuality, our full pain, our full ecstasy, but by way of the vessel that the spirit inhabits. I found that story was really embracing uncertainty as a pointer towards intimacy. Can you speak to both the uncertainty and the intimacy, and how from a brain injury that was able to open up as very neutral, but in the most sacred of ways, without any charge or any angst within it, full acceptance?
As she says, it is a lesson learned the hard way. She was an academic, a successful academic, on her way to work one morning in California. Her car collided with a Pepsi truck, or perhaps the Pepsi truck collided with her, and her life turned upside down, literally and figuratively. Suddenly, this very cerebral woman was compelled to crash land into her body. And the body at that time was a site of great anguish. Through that anguish, through her breath, she began to awaken And that awakening has now deepened, and she's in a state where she's capable of offering guidance as well. She writes a great deal. She is, to my mind, a reminder really of what the body signifies. The body is just so tragically abused in the many ways in which it is presented. And we see it all the time, right? We're living in a world that seems to celebrate the body when it is so often doing just the reverse. For me, what was important about Lata's example is that she reminds us that the body can in fact be the instrument of the sacred. And it's a reminder also, and this is something that for me was very important because I learned it too in my own somewhat different way. I believed that embarking on a spiritual journey would turn me into this wonderful, tranquil human being. What I hadn't reckoned with was the fact that I would first have to confront the messiness, the darkness, the toxicity of my own heart. And I would have to confront the body as well. I would have to inhabit them for the first time in my life, deeply, engage with them deeply. That there is no way to embark on the spiritual journey by sidestepping the heart or sidestepping the body. So this to me is what these women in their own ways point to. And when you speak of, there's the uncertainty of the path, that is absolutely the case for each of them, living it in their own ways. But there was also the other word that you mentioned, intimacy. This is one of the paradoxes, isn't it, at the heart of the spiritual life, that on the one hand, the utterances of so many of these people, these four women in the book certainly, seem detached or dispassionate, even impersonal at times. And at the same time, there is this deep, fierce intimacy, whether it's when they speak of the goddess or the guru or even the world that they live in. And I think this combination of the spacious and the intimate is one of the central paradoxes of the spiritual journey. And it is one that one uncovers and learns to live on a daily basis. That intimacy does not have to mean the physical presence of another, that there are many ways in which one can be spacious and intimate all at once.
The book itself is written in beautiful language, language that comes from you, language that comes from each one of them. But there is this thread throughout that has something to do with clothing, and that clothing is pointing us to something within each of these stories. Share what that clothing really represents and what that's asking of us.
On the one hand, there is the literal image of clothing. One woman who wears a monk's ochre, another who chooses to give up the monastic robes and now chooses to wear blue jeans, and yet another who wears no clothes at all. That, on a very literal level, is what the book is about. On the other hand, there is the constant trope through the entire book that the only way to really wear yourself is to allow yourself to plunge deep into a journey that may well demand that you drop bits of yourself along the way. Many things that you believed that you were may have to be dropped in the process. But there can be what we called earlier, that euphoric free fall, that sense of having authored in some way your own truer identity, which you are discovering and crafting at the very same time. To me, that's what these women represent, the ability to wear themselves. You know, we speak of words like authenticity so easily, Simran, but to me, they represent the courage to dig in your heels and allow yourself to embark on a journey where there will be no easy answers at the end of the day. That's the uncertainty we speak of. There will be no easy answers. There are no glib conclusions. There are no trite closures. But there is an unfolding and an ability to trust that unfolding. And in doing so, these are women who have learned and who have arrived at their own very singular strategies of wearing themselves.
And so powerfully model, which without this book we would not be able to know. Most of us would not be able to know. You begin the book saying it's so easy to live in a closet. What's the tragedy of that, if doing so in the human experience?
It's a wonderful question. If I could, I'd have lived in that closet, never knowing that there was another way to live. but I did open my coffee percolator and my roof did fly off. And I felt like I'd been ambushed by life itself. And it was terrifying. But when that happened, there was also the sense of discovering a much freer, truer sense of self than ever before. I think this coming out of this little closet that we consider to be our homes is so important in order to truly find yourself. And it's the hardest thing to do. But when roofs fly away, it can actually be a blessing in disguise.
I believe we always have signs that appear in front of us to show us something about ourselves that we have not seen, or that is subconscious, or that we are then to grow next. After meeting each one of these, the ecstatic, the contemplative, the intellectual, and the devotee, what was the mirror for you, and how did you grow from it?
I'm a listener, as I said at the start of this conversation. Because I'm a listener, I sometimes am capable of doing some kind of inspired eavesdropping, and I sometimes write a poem. In the case of this book, I was a listener who simply allowed myself to listen without being magisterial or judgmental in any way. And that was its own reward, because these women touched me deeply in their own ways, even though their orientations were sometimes somewhat different from mine. And yet I could find points of resonance and convergence with each one of them. I'm often asked, which of these women speaks to you the most? Who is your favorite? And I always say there's no question of a favorite, because each one of them touches me in her own way and reminds me that all of us have a bit of these women in us. Each of us is a devotee. Each one of us has a body and therefore cannot be unaffected by the understanding of Tantra that Lata Mani offers us. We cannot be unaffected by the understanding of sound and silence that Bala Rishi offers us. And we certainly cannot be unaffected by this image of a woman who wears her body like a lion, which is what Annapurni Amma offers us. So I went away transformed in some subtle way by each one of them. And if I had to distill it to a single takeaway, Simran, I would say that they empowered me and they offered me the reminders that I needed to be able to live this life without upping the decibel levels. We live in a world where we only believe an achievement has been made if we can wave a flag at the end of the day, brandish a certificate at the end of the day, or shout it from the rooftops. But for me, these women were a reminder that it is possible to live quietly, invisibly, sometimes inaudibly, and still make a difference. I called Annapurni Amma the wildflower that you might miss. You might miss her if you walked down that road and never turned into her ashram. You might miss her altogether. And yet, if you haven't inhaled that fragrance, or certainly if I hadn't inhaled that fragrance, my life would have been somewhat impoverished. The fragrance makes all the difference. Yes, you can miss it and maybe you can continue your life without it. But without that fragrance, your life would be poorer. So it is for me a reminder that it is possible to walk the path without using a megaphone to assert your presence, that it is possible at times to murmur and still be heard.
I invite you to be pierced by the mystery and to pick up this book and to allow yourself an unfolding that you didn't even realize was inside of you. Sometimes to meet the unknown helps us to become known in new ways. It allows the costumes to be shed and the cloaks of knowingness and everythingness to drop. And then we find our true face in the emptiness. Pick up this book, Women Who Wear Only Themselves, 4 Sacred Travelers on the Journey. As a listener, standing on the cusp of these varied articulations, Arundhathi Subramaniam knows they are not easily parsed. Annapurni Amma, girl goddess, her dialogues with long-dead saints, Balarishi's mantras that hover on the margins of meaning and non-meaning, Lata Mani's attempt to send a postcard from the bottom of the ocean, Ma Kapuri's impassioned conversations that never quite touch places of silence and melted identity. Each of these conversations requires us to taste the flavors of vocabularies that could seem alien, unreal. We may not understand them. We may not know what to make of them. We may not believe them. but I ask you to let yourself be cast into oblivion and to discover the unknown. Arundhathi, it has been an honor and a pleasure. Your book has touched my soul, and I'm just delighted to have you on 1111 Talk Radio.
Thank you so much, Simran. I was very glad to be here, and this conversation has touched me too.
I really enjoy working individually with people. If you're looking for some additional support and guidance, and you really want to dive into the subtle, then there are quite a few options on my website at iamsimran.com that have to do with shadow work or manifestation if you want a more focused approach on a particular thing, as well as individual sessions around deciphering signs, symbols, and synchronicities, gaining a better understanding of how the universe is speaking to you, your particular dialect. That link is in the bio description. Thank you so much for spending time.
Until next week, I am Simran, in love, of love, with love, and as love. Be well.
Thank you for opening your mind to a new reality, your heart to greater compassion, and your experience of aliveness with 1111 Talk Radio. Join host Simran next Tuesday at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern Time to step through the gateway of conscious living. You are not on the journey. You are the journey.